Hi. Um, so in our class, English 121 and Logic, we're about to begin a new unit digging into academic research. And we're going to be framing a question focused around figuring out what academic research says in response to a question. And to answer that kind of question, and for any other class where you're having to do research, you're going to need to know how to use databases to find credible sources. And normally, what I would do is take the class to the library and we would get an orientation to doing library research. But my experience has been that most students really need to spend some time doing the database research themselves rather than getting a overview and watching a presentation. So this screencast is supposed to guide you through the process of doing academic research. And this first one is going to be just an overview of the process and why it's so important that you get to know how to do databases specifically as opposed to just relying on Google for your research. And I wanted to start the screencast off with a quote from Charles Dickens, and this is from A Tale of Two Cities. I think he expresses almost exactly my thoughts and my feelings about how important doing research is today. So he says, "It was the best of times, it was the worst of times. It was the age of wisdom, it was the age of foolishness. It was the epoch of belief, it was the epoch of incredulity or disbelief. It was the season of light, it was the season of darkness. It was the spring of hope, it was the winter of despair. We had everything before us, we had nothing before us. We were all going direct to heaven, we were all going direct the other way. In short, the period was so far like the present period that some of its noisiest authorities insisted on its being received, for good or for evil, in the superlative degree of comparison only." And I think what he gets at is that when it comes to discerning between foolishness and wisdom, and discerning between belief and disbelief, is it really just a matter of comparison only, or can we get some level of footing as to what we should believe and what we shouldn't believe? And just as an illustration of how difficult it is to figure out what's credible and what's not credible, I wanted to point to an article by a Carol Cadwalader. Who's got a really awesome last name. And what she argues is that Google is not just a platform. It frames, shapes, and distorts how we see the world. And what this article is about is she poses the question of or she does an experiment herself, and what you can see she's doing here is typing in, "Did the Holocaust happen?" And as a result of that Google search, the first website that popped up when she did this search was "Top 10 Reasons Why the Holocaust Didn't Happen." And Holocaust Denial is the second. Holocaust Hoax is the third. And she's pointing out just how influential Google is in terms of shaping the information we get and how we get that information. And in addition to Cadwallader's argument, I also have a quote from Daniel Dennett, where he was being interviewed about his current take on research and technology in today's world. And the interviewer asked him, here says, and just by the way, Daniel Dennett is a contemporary philosopher who works with questions of consciousness. But he was asked, "I was thinking that perhaps philosophers are exactly what's needed right now. Some deep thinking about what is happening at this moment." So in response to questions of how do we handle the bulk of information that we have, but also the total difficulty in being able to figure out what we can trust and what we can't. And Dennett says, Yes, from everybody. Some deep thinking is needed from everybody. The real danger that's facing us is we've lost respect for truth and facts. People have discovered that it's much easier to destroy reputations for credibility than it is to maintain them. It doesn't matter how good your facts are, somebody else can spread the rumor that you're fake news. We're entering a period of epistemological murk and uncertainty that we've not experienced since the Middle Ages. And by epistemological, he means the study of how we know what we know. So when he says we're entering epistemological murk and uncertainty, that the difficulty in knowing what we know and being confident in what we know is becoming harder and harder. And so what we're going to be focusing on the next unit is ways and strategies for developing your own credibility, and I think partially shielding yourself from these kinds of attacks so that nobody will be able to claim that your essays that you write are fake or false, that you'll have that sense of ethos that you're trying to develop. And one tool that we'll use as kind of a guideline as we work on doing research papers is called the continuum of credibility. And what this does is it just puts a continuum together of sources that are trustworthy and reliable as opposed to sources that are less trustworthy or reliable. So web blogs or blogs, websites, things that you don't even know what they are, these are going to be stuff that you should be really skeptical about, and we're not going to allow them in the paper because it's going to undermine your credibility and just doesn't really help you when you're asking academic kinds of research questions. There's also biased sources that have a strong political advocacy that they're trying to support. There's daily news stuff, which may be okay for getting some factual information, but in an academic context, I think the degree of skepticism that we need towards information has to be higher than just what is available to the general public. This is, I think, in today's society, almost on the level of entertainment as opposed to really credible sources of information. Where it gets a little more difficult is with the high quality mainstream media, more reputable newspapers. These are stronger, but still we have to be careful about teasing out whether or not these newspapers are actually grounded in good, strong, factual information. So even some of today's best news magazines still have a political agenda that they're trying to put forward. So in general, we'll probably be avoiding even these kinds of newspapers. Where we start to get into sources that you'll be able to use with some degree of confidence is looking into books written by experts in their field, people who have spent their careers working on one particular issue question or set of issue questions and have credibility on what they're working on. There's also some government websites where the government pays for academic research to be done, and the information is made publicly available because it's funded by the public. But websites like NASA or the National Oceanic and Atmospheric Administration, the Forest Service, the Environmental Protection Agency, from what they're able to tell you anymore. These are agencies funded by the government that do academic research, much in the same way that universities do. And the, I think, most useful form of sources you're going to find are peer-reviewed scholarly journals and books published by academic presses, as opposed to more popular presses. And then some additional government sites that are involved in the same peer review process used by scholarly magazines. And by peer-reviewed, that really just means reviewed by other academics in the same field with preferably even stronger credentials than the person doing the publication. And that's a blind process where a scholar or a academic, somebody with a PhD, will get a publication that somebody is trying to publish with no name on it, and they'll read it and they'll determine whether or not that study was designed well, whether the evidence is strong enough, and whether it warrants, in terms of its significance, being published. So to go through the peer review process really helps determine the credibility of a source. So if it's been peer reviewed, you at least know that critical and skeptical experts in the field have reviewed it and approved it. One other chart that I think is a helpful illustration of how to decide which kinds of magazines might be acceptable in academic writing. And this chart helps show the different biases that you might find across a variety of actual news magazines. So obviously Fox News shows up on the conservative leaning, more partisan or more politically biased kind of news. On the other side, you're going to get like Occupy Democrats, US Uncut, the Huffington Post. These are more liberal kinds of sources that are going to have their own political agenda as well. In the middle, I guess probably the middle would depend on how you're looking at it, but sources more like NPR, BBC, Washington Post, New York Times, these are pretty strong sources, but for the purposes of academic writing, the level of detail and in-depth coverage may be lacking. So if you're going to use those sources in your writing, you would also want to spend some time in your essay defending your reasoning for why these sources are covering the issue in a way that some of the more in-depth sources would be covering it. So the more in-depth ones is, if you're going to use magazines in your essays, I would recommend sticking to the ones in this top bubble. And you still have to be careful with these, because if you're using, say, The Economist, and it's skewing towards a conservative political agenda, in your own essay, you will want to acknowledge that the source of the information there may be presented from a political angle. Likewise, if you're citing something from The Atlantic, it may come from a more liberal angle. It doesn't mean that the information is uncredible, but you'll want to back up your research with additional sources that corroborate each other. So if you're citing a fact that was cited in The Atlantic, it's helpful to look on the other side of the political aisle and see if that same factual information is verified in another magazine from a different angle. And that'll help give you a well-rounded picture of whatever kind of topic you're looking at. And it can help you figure out your own political biases. So if you find yourself believing all of the claims made in articles that are skewing liberal, you may want to do most of your research on the other side of the aisle, so you can counteract your own political biases. And finally, the last point to make is that mostly what we're going to be doing here is framing what's called issue questions. And this is what you do in almost any academic writing, but it's a kind of question that is open-ended, invites multiple points of view, responds to real problems and issues, and it helps drive an unbiased research process. And the purpose for these questions is that it really stimulates the kind of writing that's going to be valued in college. So if you're doing a research paper, the point isn't to just regurgitate a lot of facts. The point is really to immerse yourself in an ongoing dialogue on academic questions. And these questions are really usually problematic questions, ones you can't just answer, and you really have to discuss and argue and synthesize a lot of different perspectives. So the next video will walk you through these in more detail.